I used to play in a cover tune band in Indiana, and we used to cover the song Don't Cry because it was a song that no one back there knew. Everybody was into GNR, but these were songs that weren't on the Appetite album.
There are voices that don't need to scream to be heard. They simply linger softly through an opening note, and an entire generation falls silent. Shannon Hoon possessed such a voice, soaring, fragile, and haunting, as if it came from somewhere between a dream and loneliness. In 1993, when No Rain played across radios in America, people instantly remembered the little girl in the bee costume dancing in the music video. Yet few realized that behind that childlike smile was a soul crying out, the very soul of the man who wrote the song. Shannon was not like the typical rock stars of his era. He didn't smash stages, he didn't chase iconography, and he never tried to appear larger than life. He was simply a small-town kid carrying unhealed wounds, stepping onto the stage with nothing but what he had, a heart full of holes and a longing to be loved without needing to explain it. In a decade loud with grunge and rebellion, Shannon Hoon appeared as a lost angel, choosing not to scream, but to sing about what terrified him most: loneliness. And then, like so many who were too pure for a world too chaotic, he left far too young. At 28, alone on a tour bus. No stage lights, no applause. Only a videotape capturing the breaking light in his eyes, as if a farewell no one could hear. So who was Shannon Hoon? A symbol? A victim? Or simply someone who sang of sorrow before that sorrow had the chance to kill him? Let's go back to the beginning. To a boy in a small town holding his first cassette player, dreaming of things he couldn't yet name. Early life. Before becoming an alt-rock icon, Shannon Hoon was just a boy with blonde hair and eyes that always drifted toward the window, toward the cornfields stretching endlessly to the horizon. He was born on September 26, 1967, in Lafayette, Indiana, a small, rural town where life moved slowly, thoughts stayed simple, and dreamers had no place. The Hoon family belonged to the working class, his father a construction worker, his mother a sales clerk. Their marriage fractured early, leaving Shannon to grow up in a home without a father figure, a hollow space he would never truly fill. He lived with his mother and his older sister Anna, who later became his first guide into music. It was Anna who placed records by the Beatles, Grateful Dead, and Led Zeppelin into Shannon's hands, strange and enchanting sounds that made the 10-year-old boy feel for the first time understood. At school, Shannon never fit in. He wasn't good at sports, wasn't social, and was often mocked for his eccentric personality and odd clothes. He would sit alone, scribbling lyrics into his notebooks or staring blankly at the sky. One teacher once wrote in her notes, "Shannon dreams more than he studies." But perhaps it was those very dreams that saved him from the suffocation of small-town life, where people clung to the safe path and laughed at anyone who dared to step aside. Music slowly became his only refuge. He learned to play guitar and began singing at small parties with friends. Nobody truly understood what he was doing, but those closest to him could feel something growing inside Shannon. A silent storm. Not loud, not showy, but fierce, in a way only the abandoned could understand. By the late 1980s and his early 20s, Shannon left Lafayette. He didn't take much, just a backpack, a guitar, and unfinished demo tapes. No one came to see him off at the bus station, but he knew if he stayed, he would slowly die, not from hunger, but from the hunger to be heard. And so, the lonely boy left that too small town to search for something bigger, a voice, a place, or at the very least somewhere he no longer had to fight against himself. Early career. Los Angeles in the late 1980s was no place for the weak, and Shannon Hoon knew it well. Yet he still left Lafayette, Indiana, with nothing more than an old backpack, a notebook full of clumsy lyrics, and eyes that carried the loneliness of youth. He didn't come chasing stardom. He came because he felt compelled, because if he didn't, he would never know who he really was. The chaotic city was both unforgiving and alien, but for Hoon, it was the only escape from the suffocating loop of small-town life. In his early days in Los Angeles, Shannon had virtually nothing. No contacts, no money, no plan. He drifted between indie studios, auditioned in dingy bars, and sang for crowds that hardly bothered to look up. Yet it was in those cramped, indifferent rooms that he learned how to sing as if every song were his last plea for salvation. He didn't polish his technique or try to please the audience. He sang simply to keep himself from falling apart. The turning point came when Shannon crossed paths with three young musicians, Brad Smith, Roger Stevens, and Glenn Graham. They too carried the same outsider's loneliness, hailing from Mississippi and Pennsylvania. They weren't chasing the rising wave of grunge, nor did they care for the glitz of glam rock. They loved Crosby, Stills, and Nash, Pink Floyd, Neil Young, old folk and psychedelic music that still felt free. When they jammed together, no words were necessary. A few chords, a few spontaneous riffs, and it was clear they had found each other. From that quiet bond, a band was born. They called it Blind Melon, a name that sounded like a hippie joke, but in truth was a declaration. They would not be like anyone else. Fate added yet another unexpected piece. Axl Rose, the frontman of Guns N' Roses and a fellow native of Lafayette, discovered Shannon and immediately recognized the uniqueness of his raspy voice. Axl invited him to sing backing vocals on the song Don't Cry, featured on Use Your Illusion Sakun, 1991. It was an extraordinary opportunity for an unknown singer barely settled in Los Angeles to have his voice heard on one of the decade's biggest rock albums. But Shannon refused to let it define him as Axl Rose's shadow. To him, it was simply a door opening, a reminder that persistence could carve out his own path. With Blind Melon, Shannon became the soul of the band, not through vocal precision, but through the way he sang, as if pouring his very being into every note. He didn't step on stage to perform, he stepped on stage to survive. And that made the band different. They weren't grunge, weren't punk, weren't glam. They were a strange collision of nostalgia and rebellion, of tender folk and hazy psychedelia. In 1991, Blind Melon signed with Capitol Records. Shannon called it a double-edged sentence, both a dream realized and a warning. He knew a contract meant pressure, control, and the blinding spotlight he had never prepared himself for. Yet inside the studio, standing before the microphone, for the first time in his life, he felt something solid, something undeniably real. Music. It was fragile and terrifying, but also the only thing anchoring him in a world spinning too fast. From a small-town dreamer clutching a notebook, Shannon Hoon had now stepped through the doors of American rock. He couldn't yet know that the spotlight would soon expose wounds that had never healed, and that sometimes the light itself can burn away what remains of a man. But for Shannon, in that moment, the journey had only just begun. Career success. In 1992, Blind Melon released their self-titled debut album. At a time when Seattle was the epicenter of the music world with Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden, Blind Melon carved out their own path. They didn't scream rebellion through distorted guitars, nor did they cloak themselves in grunge's darkness. Their sound reached backward, to the 1960s, to folk and blues, to earthy melodies and shimmering harmonies. And at the center of it all, Shannon Hoon became the soul of the band, not through vocal technique, but with a raw, heartfelt delivery that sounded like a confession sung in front of strangers. The album Blind Melon, 1992, opened with the single Tones of Home, a folk rock track bursting with energy. Its video received heavy rotation on MTV, bringing the band its first real attention. Yet behind its brightness, the lyrics mirrored Shannon's inner state, a restless young man, far from home, searching for where he belonged. The ballad Change carried a more somber tone, anchored by the prophetic line, "When life is hard, you have to change." After Shannon's death, fans would look back at the song as a chilling foreshadowing of his fate. But everything truly exploded in 1993 with the release of No Rain. Its folk pop melody was deceptively simple, almost childlike in its innocence. Yet it carried an unmistakable loneliness. "All I can say is that my life is pretty plain, / I like watching the puddles gather rain." What cemented its place in cultural history was the music video. The now iconic B-Girl, awkward in her costume, ridiculed and dancing alone in the street until she finally finds her tribe of fellow bees. It struck a chord with millions of young people who felt like outcasts. More than just a music video, it became a cultural symbol, proof that the lonely and the different also deserve a place to belong. No Rain propelled Blind Melon to the top. The song dominated MTV's video charts, saturated radio playlists, and pushed the debut album to platinum status. Suddenly, Shannon Hoon, with his long hair, sad eyes, and unforced voice, became one of the new faces of the 1990s. He didn't look or act like a rock star, and that vulnerability only deepened the connection a generation felt with him. The unexpected success took the band across the world. They opened for legends like Neil Young, Lenny Kravitz, and even the Rolling Stones. At Woodstock '94, they performed before tens of thousands. Shannon walked on stage in a wedding dress, shocking audiences and the press alike. To many, it looked like a stunt. To Shannon, it was rebellion against conformity. Controversial or not, the performance cemented Blind Melon's image. They weren't just a one-hit wonder, but a band willing to be defiantly authentic. Yet, at the height of the spotlight, Shannon began to unravel. He didn't know how to exist within fame. In a 1994 interview with Rolling Stone, he confessed, "I never expected people to love us like that, and now that they do, I don't know what to do with it." Endless touring, relentless interviews, and Capitol Records pressuring the band to deliver another No Rain wore him down. Alcohol, cocaine, and eventually heroin entered, not for celebration, but as tools to endure the very light he once dreamed of standing under. Amid this chaos, Blind Melon entered the studio to record their second album, Soup, 1995. It marked a dramatic shift. Gone were the sunny harmonies, replaced by a darker, harsher, more chaotic sound, yet also their most honest work. Shannon's lyrics read like diary entries, unflinching and unfiltered. Galaxy centered on his beloved VW Beetle, both nostalgic and haunted. Mouthful of Cavities, a painful duet with Gina Kraus, felt like a cry from the hollow within him. Saint, Andrew's Fall depicted the suicide of a young girl, drenched in eerie melancholy, and Skinned, disturbingly playful, spun the story of serial killer Ed Gein with morbid irony. Bassist Brad Smith later reflected, "Shannon meant every word on the Soup record. People recognize it as the truth, and Pure Soup never courted radio success, but it stood as a raw chronicle of an artist losing control of his own life." During this period, Blind Melon also delivered remarkable performances. One of the most haunting was their MTV Unplugged 1995 session. Stripped of electricity and effects, Shannon's trembling voice and sorrowful eyes held the room in silence, exposing the fragility behind his public persona. But no amount of creativity could shield him from the shadows consuming him. While the world kept singing No Rain, its author could no longer find shelter from the storm within. Success had lifted him to heaven, but it had also opened the door to a personal hell. Blind Melon had become a band recognized worldwide, but their very soul, Shannon Hoon, was fracturing more each day. Turmoil and shadows. Early success doesn't always open the door to freedom. It can just as easily become a gilded cage. For Shannon Hoon, the blinding light of No Rain never dispelled his loneliness. It only made the cracks in his soul more visible. When the debut album went platinum, when fans began hailing him as the voice of a new generation, Shannon quietly slipped into the shadows, unnoticed by those around him. Endless tours, relentless interviews, and constant pressure from Capitol Records, who demanded another No Rain, quickly eroded him. Blind Melon's members watched a man unravel before their eyes. Chronic insomnia, wild mood swings, bursts of manic energy followed by haunting silences. He drank to sleep, used cocaine to stay awake, turned to heroin to quiet the noise in his head. Music, once his only refuge, had now become a crushing weight. The breaking point became undeniable at Woodstock '94. Before tens of thousands of fans, Shannon stumbled onto the stage wearing his girlfriend's wedding dress, slurring and laughing in a drunken haze. The press called him an act of artistic suicide. But to those who knew him, it wasn't a stunt. It was a desperate, wordless cry for help. The band was forced to hire a recovery supervisor to shadow him on tour, tasked solely with preventing Shannon from destroying himself. Even so, his condition never truly improved. By 1995, Blind Melon entered the studio to record their second album, Soup. Gone was the breezy accessibility that had once lifted them to MTV stardom. What emerged instead was an audio diary of a fractured mind. 2X4 chronicled Shannon's first attempt at rehab, raw, jagged, painful. Saint. Andrew's Fall recounted a suicide he had witnessed, sung with a chilling detachment. New Life, written for his newborn daughter Nico Blue, carried both warmth and despair. A confession of his fear that he could never be the father he longed to be. And Mouthful of Cavities, a haunting duet with Gina Kraus, played like a whispered farewell with no escape. Bassist Brad Smith later admitted, "Shannon meant every word on the Soup record. People recognize it as the truth and pure." Indeed, Soup was never made for radio or MTV. It was a brutal honesty, Shannon's attempt to piece together his own fragments, a way of preparing to leave in silence. Even the joy of Nico Blue's birth in July 1995 was shadowed by fear. In his journal, Shannon confessed, "What if I become the father I never wanted? What if I'm too broken to protect her?" Love and terror collided, turning him into a man desperate for connection, yet terrified of the role he was now bound to. In those final months, Shannon carried a small video camera everywhere, documenting his daily life. More than 200 hours of footage remain, painting a disturbing portrait. Hours spent staring into mirrors, muttering nonsense, delivering rambling monologues about emptiness. In one clip from mid-1995, he whispered, "I don't think anyone really knows me. Not even me." It wasn't just a statement. It was the epitaph of his life. Years later, those very tapes became the foundation of the documentary All I Can Say, 2019, one of rock's most haunting self-written farewells. On stage, things grew more fragile than ever. During the Soup promotional tour, Blind Melon often endured Shannon's drugged, erratic performances, missing cues, sometimes abandoning songs mid-set. Some shows collapsed into disaster, yet the band carried on, partly under financial pressure, partly clinging to the faint hope that Shannon might still find his way back. But those closest to him knew better. Shannon was no longer writing to survive. He was organizing his emotions to leave quietly. Blind Melon's final tour became a one-way journey. He slept longer hours on the bus, withdrew from conversation, and spent his waking moments filming his own reflection. And then, one October morning, while the rest of the band slept, Shannon Hoon remained alone on the tour bus, surrounded by unfinished lyrics, an untold tape still spinning, and a pain no one close enough could name. Personal life. Behind the chaotic stages, the tangled hair and the wandering eyes, Shannon Hoon was simply a man who longed for someone to hold on to him. Not because he was famous, but because he was unbearably fragile. Those who loved him often said the same thing. Shannon was gentle to the point of being dangerous. Not dangerous to others, but to himself. Because that gentleness often came with an inability to protect himself from pain. Unlike the stereotype of a rock star, Shannon was not entangled in noisy affairs, nor did he live recklessly among endless parties. Long before fame, he was already committed to Lisa Krause, a quiet woman, almost the complete opposite of his world. Lisa didn't need Shannon to be an artist, didn't need the spotlight. She only wanted him to come home safe each night. But that very sense of peace frightened Shannon. He feared he would disappoint her, feared he wasn't good enough, feared one day he might destroy the only unbroken thing in his life. Their love was like trying to build a house in the middle of a storm. Some nights, Lisa traveled with him on tour, sitting silently backstage, watching him perform in a drugged haze, his voice slipping, his gaze vacant. Some nights she left early, unable to endure his unspoken depressions. Yet she always came back, and Shannon, though trembling with fear of losing her, clung to that love as if it were the last thread tethering him to the world. In July 1995, while Blind Melon was still consumed by touring and Shannon was drowning in drugs, a new life appeared. Nico Blue Hoon, his and Lisa's daughter, was born. Shannon cried when he first held her, then laughed through tears and said, "She's the only thing that makes sense now." It was one of the rare moments he felt the world still had a reason to exist. He wrote the song New Life as a gift for her, a short, simple ballad filled with trembling hope. That if he could not be a good father, at least he could leave behind a melody for her to remember him by. But joy was quickly swallowed by darkness. Shannon had grown up without a father and had watched his mother endure wounds he could never forget. Now, as he faced fatherhood himself, that past returned to haunt him. In an unpublished journal entry, he wrote, What if I become the father I never wanted? What if I'm too broken to protect her? His love for Nico and Lisa often turned into pressure, pushing him further into self-doubt. To his friends, Shannon was painfully sensitive, easily wounded by the smallest things. A careless remark, an indifferent glance, a cold message could send him spiraling into sudden depression. After a concert in Austin, he scribbled in his notebook, "I want to be needed, not wanted. I want to be held, not seen." Those words revealed a man who had never found safety, even in the arms of those who loved him most. Lisa could not join the band's final tour. Nico was too young. Before leaving home, Shannon promised her that this time would be different, that this time he would return and make it right. But the tapes he left behind on the tour bus told another story. In one recording, Shannon whispered into the lens, "Maybe one day she'll understand why Daddy couldn't stay." But I hope she'll forgive him anyway. Shannon Hoon did not die for lack of love. He died because he could not believe he deserved to be saved by that love. His deepest tragedy was not drugs nor fame, but the fact that he never learned how to love himself. And when a man cannot love himself, every other love, no matter how deep, becomes powerless. Death and aftermath. On October 21st, 1995, the New Orleans sky was bright and scorching like any other day. But in the parking lot behind a small hotel, Blind Melon's tour bus sat unusually silent, heavy with an unfamiliar stillness. Inside, Shannon Hoon lay motionless on the same long couch where he had spent countless hours with his small handheld camera, recording whispers and vacant stares. This time, there were no images captured, no breath, no life. He was gone, 28 years old, alone. Cause of death: acute cocaine intoxication. The night before, Shannon had still been talking with the band about their upcoming shows. No one imagined it would be the last time they would hear his voice. When everyone else went back to their hotel rooms, Shannon stayed behind on the bus, as he often did. The rehab monitor, hired specifically to accompany him on tour and keep him safe, was absent that night. Just one night without a watchful presence, and Shannon slipped into the very fate everyone had feared all along. The next morning, bassist Brad Smith opened the bus door. What he saw froze him in place. Shannon lying still, his body already cold. No signs of struggle, no wounds, no suicide note. Only a suitcase filled with videotapes. Over 200 hours of footage he had recorded himself, as if he somehow knew he would not go much further. The news spread quickly, and Blind Melon collapsed the same day. The tour was canceled immediately. Their album, Soup, released only 2 months earlier, suddenly became an unintended musical epitaph. Every track, from St. Andrew's Fall to New Life, now rang with grim foreshadowing. The remaining members were left in shock. They hadn't just lost a singer, they had lost a friend who had walked with them from anonymous garages to the heights of MTV fame. Shannon's family chose not to hold a public funeral. His ashes were brought back to Lafayette, Indiana, the small town he once fled because he felt he didn't belong. In silence, they laid him to rest among the cornfields where he had first heard the Beatles and believed that music could save a life. Bitterly, music had not been enough to save his. The public reaction was one of devastation. Many fans wept at the news, recognizing a familiar pattern. Just a year after Kurt Cobain's death in 1994, another fragile talent of the 1990s had fallen. The press called him the Kurt Cobain of folk rock, an artist too delicate to survive in such a brutal world. MTV replayed No Rain endlessly. and the image of the B-girl dancing in a field transformed into a symbol of lost innocence. Friends and colleagues voiced their grief. Guitarist Roger Stevens admitted in anguish, he was a tyrant and an angel, a child and a poet, and we loved him even when he didn't. Brad Smith echoed quietly, Shannon meant every word he sang. That's why it hurts so much contemporary bands, from Pearl Jam to Soundgarden, spoke of him as a brother in the fragile, burgeoning alternative scene that had already lost too much. To honor him, Blind Melon released the compilation album Nico, 1996, named after the infant daughter he left behind. It contained unreleased demos, unfinished songs, and raw recordings, stitched together as an unspoken farewell. All proceeds were directed into a scholarship fund for Nico Blue Hoon. For fans, Nico was Shannon's final echo, proof that he had tried to sing the rest of his life, even when his strength had run out. Time passed, but Shannon Hoon's resonance never faded. He was not remembered as a towering superstar, but as a rare voice that could turn loneliness into empathy. More than 2 decades later, the videotapes he left behind were compiled into the documentary All I Can Say, 2019, one of the rawest artistic testaments in rock history. The film offered no narration, no artificial framing, only what Shannon had seen, said, feared, and loved. In its closing moments, the camera shakes, the lens blurs, and his face appears one last time in a mirror. No goodbye, no tears. Only the gaze of a man who knew he was about to disappear, and a world that never heard his final cry. For fans, Shannon Hoon remains forever the young man in the meadow of no rain, singing about a life that was pretty plain. But after his death, the song ceased to be just a summer anthem. It became a requiem, a reminder that behind an artist's smile can sometimes lie an abyss no one else can reach. Legacy and influence. Shannon Hoon did not leave behind a vast legacy. He had no string of blockbuster albums, no chance to enter the ranks of great artists enshrined in the Hall of Fame. Yet that has never stopped people from remembering him. For those who ever listened to No Rain, saw his eyes on stage, or stumbled upon a monologue in All I Can Say, Shannon was never just a singer. He was a feeling, unfinished, hard to name, but lingering long after the song had ended. After Hoon's death, Blind Melon fell into paralysis. They didn't break up immediately, but everyone knew. That voice could never be replaced. The memorial album Nico, 1996, named after his daughter, became a raw, grief-stricken testament. Inside were unfinished demos, final voice messages, and rough, unedited recordings, as if Hoon were still singing into the void left by his own absence. In the years that followed, Shannon Hoon was remembered as a lost angel of the 90s generation, alongside Kurt Cobain, Lane Staley, Jeff Buckley. But if Cobain screamed with rage and Buckley sang like a dream, then Hoon whispered as though he were singing only to one person, and that person was himself. In 2019, the documentary All I Can Say was released. Built from over 200 hours of footage, Shannon had filmed himself during his final years. No narration, no heavy editing, no recreations. Only him, laughing, crying, sitting in silence, staring at the ceiling, placing the camera on his knees, and speaking words no one had heard before. This was not a film about an artist. It was a journey inside a soul, preserved by someone who was slowly disappearing. The film premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, earning praise from critics and audiences alike, not for glamour, but for its heartbreaking honesty. Variety wrote, "Hoon's footage is a gift, not to himself, but to us. the ones who never truly saw the man behind the song. His daughter, Nico Blue Hoon, is now grown. She didn't fully pursue music, but she has helped preserve her father's memory, participating in the film's production, staying connected with blind Melon fans, and occasionally attending tribute events. On social media, she once wrote, "I never knew him, but every time someone tells me how much his music helped them, I feel like I do." For later generations, Shannon Hoon is not as famous as the names carved deep into rock history. But for those who have ever felt lost, ever thought no one understood them, ever heard a melody late at night and suddenly felt less alone, Shannon is still singing. Not on stage, not on the radio, but in whispers that have never gone silent. Shannon Hoon was never truly a star. He didn't follow formulas. He wasn't perfectly handsome. He didn't preach philosophy or make shocking statements. He was simply a man who sang, with everything he had, with the cracks in his heart, with a loneliness no one else could see. And in the end, it was that very thing that drowned him. When No Rain floated onto the airwaves one afternoon in 1993, the world was stunned by its sweetness, innocence, and lightness, like sunshine breaking after a storm. But very few knew that while everyone was humming along, the man who wrote it was struggling just to survive each day. And when his voice fell silent, people began to rewind the tapes, read the lyrics more closely, and realize it wasn't just a charming hit. It was a cry for help. Shannon didn't die from drugs. He died because too few understood that the ones who smile the most are often the saddest. He died from constantly hiding his pain in melodies, in self-recorded monologues no one watched, in apologies no one heard in time. Maybe he didn't want to be saved. Or maybe he just wanted someone to sit beside him, say nothing, and let him simply be, not a symbol, not an alt-rock frontman, not a rebellious kid, just a son, a lover, a father, a man singing in the rain, and a voice no one could hold on to. And what about you? Have you ever listened to No Rain on a bad day and suddenly felt like you could breathe again? Have you ever felt like the B-girl, lost, different, but still dancing in your own way? If your answer is yes, then perhaps you've been carrying a piece of Shannon Hoon with you all along, without even knowing it. Share it in the comments. What moment made you feel Shannon truly reached you? And if this story touched you, hit like, subscribe, so we can keep telling the stories of souls like his. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. Though Shannon Hoon is gone, like all true storytellers, he is still whispering somewhere if you are willing to listen.